If we have not met yet, my name is Rebecca Jacobson. I have the privilege of leading at Youth Ministry Consultants. We're a nonprofit that started 6 years ago to bridge the gap between resourcing specifically for the smaller church. And so we do training, resourcing, coaching, and our target audience is really the awesome individuals that say yes to groups of kids that are about 10-ish kids, because that work matters so much. And I know that some of you, it's not all of you, but we're just happy to serve youth workers. We wanted to make sure that you knew a couple weeks ago, we launched a new initiative called Small Youth Ministry. The link is in the chat. But this is a growing database of just free resources for youth workers like you. We want to make it easy for you to say yes. And if that means you're going straight from work to youth group, we want to put stuff in your hands that make it a little less stressful to walk into the building and minister to teens. And so that's there. And we also host stuff like this once a month. And so you can catch everything that's coming up on our website, and we encourage you to check that out. I'm excited to hand it over to Marco this morning. Mark Oestreicher has been a leader in the youth ministry field for many years, speaks to youth workers across the world in a lot of spaces, and seems to be always on the go. And so I'm really thankful that he had some time to sit with us today and talk about some characteristics of really great ministries. And so, Marco, I will hand it off to you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Good morning, everyone. Nice to see your happy, smiley faces. Oh, and somebody's dancing behind Sammy, which is extra fun. That's just a bonus.
I hang out with some tiny friends on Thursdays. And
that's great. I love it. Adds a little zip to the space. Great. Well, thanks for hanging out for an hour. I kind of like that it's a smaller group today. I hope that can create some opportunity for some dialogue and stuff. So my request would be that you just interrupt me at any point. You're welcome to do the little, hand raising thing, but you don't have to. You can just interrupt me. I am 100% good with that. So if you got a question, your comment, clarification, anything at all, please just do so. So I'll also tell you one more thing bio-wise. I have been in youth ministry forever. I was just telling Rebecca that Ginny and I have been friends I did the math like 2 weeks ago for some reason. I can't remember what it was. But we've been friends for 35 years.
Oh, wow.
Which is nuts. Yeah. She was only 11 when we met, so yeah. But I'm still in it with like real teenagers too. Last night, I lead an 8th grade boys small group at my church, and was with them last night. It was one of those zooey nights. I left feeling like, yeah, that was good. But there were moments in the midst of it when I thought, the wheels are coming off. So it was one of those tension nights, but good stuff. Okay, here's where we're gonna go. I do travel around a lot and meet with youth workers a lot, and not just even in the US, but kind of all over the world. And I've been pushing for, and I'm not the only voice on this, but I've been pushing for change in the world of youth ministry for a long time. And I wrote a book a long time ago called Youth Ministry 3.0 that was trying to identify some of what needed to change. In the wake of that, I had quite a bit of dialogue with a good friend of mine, Kurt Johnston. Some of you may have heard Kurt's name. He works at Saddleback. And Kurt kept saying to me, you sound like you think the sky is falling, and there's so many good things happening in youth ministry. If that book is naming how the glass is half full or half empty, are you ever going to identify where the glass is half full? And so I spent some time wrestling with that. And then a few years ago, I released a little tiny book called What's Right About Youth Ministry, 6 Values That Great Youth Ministries Embrace. This is not a promo for that book. I don't care at all if you buy it or not. I'm just telling you where this came from. And what I would say is that as I peruse the world of youth ministry and see what ministries seem to be thriving, that they have a healthy culture, that their churches embrace the spiritual development of teenagers. They may be growing numerically, although that's a faulty metric often. But there's just good stuff happening, right? Instead of a place of fear and reducing. I kind of noticed some commonalities, and that's what we're going to do. I didn't feel like we had time for all 6 of them today, so that's why we're doing 3 today. At the end, I will mention what the other 3 values were that I identified. But we're going to spend a little time talking about 3 of them. So let's just dive right in. Number 1, by the way, I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy and paste into the chat kind of a summary statement for each of these, and hopefully that'll be helpful for you. So the first one is the long view. And the little summary statement is that the humble youth worker knows and lives a ministry approach that actively practices faith in God to transform lives, knowing we are powerless to change hearts. So this value is not about longevity in youth ministry. That is a trend in the youth ministry world, and it's a really good trend. I've been so encouraged to see how many youth workers stay for a longer amount of time. Oh, we got a little feedback there for a second. There used to be this commonly held statement about the average youth worker being at their church for 18 months. I think that was an urban myth. I don't think I ever saw actual data about that. But it definitely used to be shorter because it was so common in churches for youth workers to be there as a stepping stone to some other quote unquote real ministry. And I've just seen this lengthening. But that's not what this value is about. This value is about a humble posture that realizes A, teenagers are on a lifelong pathway of growth, and that this few years that we're working with them are not the only years of that process. And B, ultimately, I am an environmental host. I'm a tour guide to the Christian faith, but I can't actually make change happen. So it puts me into a place of humility, a posture of humility, as I'm hoping to host interaction between the Spirit who brings change and the God who loves them, right? And those teenagers. So I will fully acknowledge that a lot of these values we're going to talk about are things that I had to unlearn because I had wrong-headed ideas about them for a very long time. And this is one of them. Maybe some of it is my personality type, or maybe some of it was immaturity on my part. Certainly some of it was as a guy who is committed to junior high ministry. I often felt like the underdog and had to justify the importance of the ministry that we were doing with young teens. But I spent a bunch of years trying to convince people that like junior high ministry was the most important ministry in the church. And to the exclusion of other ages, right? I also was under this wrong-headed idea that I should somehow measure my success by how kids looked when they graduated from 8th grade, which is a little bit silly. I think we can all acknowledge, right? Somewhere along the line, I started shifting that and realizing, I guess, partially based on some research and stuff, that we really need to rethink that, because with the developmental realities of middle schoolers, and this is not about middle school ministry, I'm just telling you my process on this, you really can't measure your success at that point, right? They just haven't worked a lot of things out yet. So I started saying in seminars and things that you need to measure your success by how teenagers are living their lives or what their faith looks like. And sometimes I would say 18 years old, sometimes I would say 21 years old. But then I was confronted with my wrong thinking about this in a moment in time over coffee with a former student of mine. So here's the story. His name's Michael. Michael would be in his mid-30s now, I would say. When Michael was going into 8th grade, summer between 7th and 8th grade, I was working at a church, and I had gotten a promotion that was going to take me out of day-to-day regular youth ministry work. And I knew selfishly that I was going to be at risk of drying up, because I love spending time with teenagers. And so, for reasons that I would say were just a little bit more selfish, you could say, than ministry minded, nothing wrong with that, I chose 3 boys that were all incoming, they might have been incoming 7th graders, that I was going to meet with weekly. And it was kind of like something between discipleship and mentoring. And every week, these 3 guys agreed to do a minimum of 3 devotions that I gave them to work through. I did them also. And we met on Sunday night, because our ministry didn't have Sunday night programming. We met on Sunday night, mostly at Taco Bell, and talked through our devotional time. We met for 2 years, and it was not an official part of our ministry. We didn't call it anything. It was just me and these 3 guys. None of them were active leaders when they started, or had what I would consider any particular maturity, but they all seemed like guys who were, for 7th grade guys, had a level of curiosity and willingness to get to talk about stuff, right? So I knew we'd have good conversations, and we did. We met for 2 years. It was amazing. Some of the best ministry I've ever been involved in my 42 years of work with middle schoolers. And I look back on it as a highlight, right? Michael grew like crazy, as did the other 2 guys. They all became student leaders, and we talked about everything. We talked about life and faith and families and girls and the Bible and theology, and just it was fantastic. They were also involved in everything that good, robust youth ministry had to offer, and all of them came from pretty solid homes. So I say that to say these 3 guys they did receive, you could say, the best of what a church and a family system might have to offer. You should be able to almost confidently predict that they would hold on to their faith. So the summer between Michael's 8th and 9th grade year is when I moved to San Diego, and he was moving to high school, and that group stopped meeting, and I lost touch with him. I had heard that he had a skateboard accident and had a closed head injury. He was in the hospital for over a month. He was home on bed rest for the whole fall semester and was not at school or at church. I had written him a card or something. I didn't even live in the area anymore. And I totally assumed that the church's high school ministry, which he would have been part of at that point, would have been very proactive in reaching out to him. But he fell through the cracks, and nobody reached out to him. Now, that's a bummer, big time. But we also know that sometimes we drop the ball, and that was a larger youth ministry. It's one of the problems in larger youth ministry is, right, it's that we can bobble things. I think same kind of thing. Somebody might have sent him an email or written him a card, but nobody visited. In December, I didn't know any of this story, by the way, until he was 27 and a half years old and we met for coffee. But he told me this whole story. In December of that year, he was given the green light to go back to school and come back to his full living. And he showed up on a Sunday morning. And I realized this was the first time he had been to church in about 4 months. And it was going to be his very first time of attending the high school ministry on a Sunday morning. But he knew a lot of kids there. He walked into the back of the room in that kind of shuffling around time. And he told me a couple people said, "Hey, Michael," but nobody said, "How's your head?" or "We missed you," or "How are you doing?" Nobody acknowledged what he'd been through. It was only a few minutes, right? And so he was, of course, viewing this through his 14-year-old lens of the world. And he decided in that moment, this is a joke. These people don't care. I don't belong. And he walked out. Those like 7 or 8 minutes were his entire experience of that church's high school ministry. He never came back. And he ended up at 16 dropping out of school, literally one of the most intelligent kids I ever worked with, but he was bored at school. He got his dad to co-sign on a loan, and he opened a skateboard store at 16, and shockingly, it failed. And as soon as he turned 18, that was up in Los Angeles where I lived at the time. He moved to Las Vegas, and he got involved in everything you would not want one of your students or former students to get involved in. Just lots of partying and drugs and living from couch to couch, and really dark years. I have a vague memory that I had some kind of contact with him in the early days of social media, and I'm guessing that it was MySpace. That tells you how long ago it was. And I remember even at that time, he seemed like he was in a very dark place. Fast forward, he told me that when he was about 25, he realized, I got to get my act together. And so he made a whole bunch of choices. He stopped partying as much. He got a good job at an accounting firm, and he got several promotions within a couple of years, and he became a manager. He bought a condo. He bought a nice car. He got a nice girlfriend. And he said at 27 and a half years old, when he and I met, he was 29 years old. That's right. At 27 and a half years old, he said he took stock of his life, and he said to himself, I'm doing great. I mean, look at this. I've got a great job with a great income, a fantastic condo, a fantastic car, an awesome girlfriend. And then he said, but I realized I have this one unresolved area in my life. And it's this whole question of church and faith. Said he'd never given up on believing that God existed, but he thought Christianity was a joke and that churches were all hypocrites. And he realized, again, 27 and a half, he realized, I need to decide whether my 14-year-old self's conclusion was correct or incorrect. And I need to do that by going to some church one more time to see if I was right or wrong, which is should be a little scary that somebody would randomly walk into church with that intention, right? He chose the church to go to on a Sunday morning in the way that I would probably not want somebody to choose a church, and that's that he saw a billboard for a church. He knew it was a big church, which meant that he thought he could be more anonymous. And so that next Sunday morning, he went to church. He had full sleeve tattoos by that point in his life. And so he wore a tank top to church because his whole plan was, I'm going to park at the farthest corner of the parking lot, and I hope that there's enough distance between where I park and the front of the church that somebody will say something negative or give me a nasty look about my tattoos that I won't have to go in. I will be able to conclude my 14-year-old self was correct. So he parks his car. He's very nervous, wearing his tank top with his tats hanging out, right? He starts walking to the church. Somebody else had parked way out there on the far side of the parking lot also. And the first person that he saw said to him, "Great tats, man. Who does your work?" And he said, like, a switch flipped and he was back. He went in, doesn't even remember what happened. It was like a euphoric experience. He had a palpable experience of God. And a year and a half later, I was in Vegas with my family, and he saw that I was there on Facebook or something and reached out to me and asked if we could have coffee. And that's where I heard this whole story. By then, he was a high school small group leader at that church and just really flourishing. Now, long story. As he was telling me the story, I had a few thoughts very quickly. One was, oh gosh, I've been telling people that they can't measure their success in junior high ministry by how kids look when they're 14. You have to wait till they're 18 or 21. And if we had measured Michael's success, our success with Michael, by what he was like at 18 or 21, it still would have been a check mark in the failure column. And at 24, like post-college, still a failure. 27 should be fully on the road to adulting, still a failure. It was 27 and a half. And I had this very brief thought that I should change that point in my seminars to, we need to measure our success by how kids look when they're 27 and a half, which of course is absurd. And I realized I'm just viewing this wrong. And it pushed me into this humble place. Not that I'm the most humble man in America, but a sense of humility toward what transformation in students actually looks like. The reality is, God is pursuing every kid in your church and in your community long before you ever meet them or have contact with them in your youth ministry. God is pursuing every one of them during the years they're in your ministry, or you're hoping to reach them, and God will continue to be pursuing them for the rest of their lives. The years we have with them are very important. Doesn't minimize it at all. But this is a lifelong pursuit from Jesus, and you and I get invited to play a role during a very important season. So that puts us into this place of humility. I think it's funny how arrogant many of our goals and expectations are in the youth ministry world. The long view is about an opening of hands, about releasing control. Okay, I'm going to charge on. You're welcome to interrupt me, remember. Value number 2. Sorry, got to get my little cut and paste here. Value number 2 is the power of small. Since small churches often don't have the resources to develop impressive programs fueled by amazing technology, they are forced to settle, very important air quotes there, for the core of what really works in youth ministry, a caring, Jesus-following adult engaging a small group of teenagers. So I grew up in a big church in Detroit with a big youth ministry, and then I became a junior high specialist. So it's only big churches that have a junior high specialist. That colored my thinking about what good youth ministry is. Right? I would have never said this, but I had this unexamined belief that is very American, by the way, that bigger is better. And that if you're bigger, then you must have more validity, and that your thinking and your practice and everything must have, it's more worthy. And we replicate that in lots of ways in the American church, right? We tend to the people who get asked to speak and get asked to write books and stuff often are that bigger church world. I'm so glad that this new small church youth ministry initiative from Ginny and Rebecca is available and encouraging, because I've really come to believe that the pathway to great youth ministry is shorter in a smaller church. And the larger the ministry, the harder it is to have a great youth ministry. It might look flashy, but in terms of substantive growth and change, discipleship taking place in the lives of teenagers, the flash isn't worth much at all. Now, I tell you a little bit of my own story on that, and the fact that I had this unexamined bias toward bigger being better, because I was, once again, like I was with that first value, I was confronted with my wrong thinking about this in a moment. It happened because I spoke at 2 events, 2 weekends in a row that were really similar. One was the statewide, it was the Arkansas Conference of the Methodist Church statewide youth event. It was a weekend event, kind of like a camp, but at a hotel. 4 main sessions, just like a retreat format, 4 main sessions and a bunch of other stuff. And in the main sessions, pretty much like any retreat you've been on, the format was pretty similar. There would be like some fun stuff up front and some announcements from some MCs, which usually in the Methodist world, those are teenagers, part of a planning team that are teenagers. And then there's a worship time, and then the speaker, which in this case was me. And I have a practice when I'm speaking to on a group of teenagers that I haven't met before, that in the first session during the worship time, I stand in the front corner of the room and look at their faces while I'm praying that God would help me to be in the right space, that God would work through me, and that I do that because I want to see that these are real teenagers, not theoretical teenagers. And that first weekend, I did that practice. I can't say that I noticed anything particularly it wasn't like I thought, oh, this is awesome, or this is horrible, or it just was. I think in hindsight, I don't know that I noticed in the moment, but in hindsight, I noticed there's a lot of pretty kids here, like a lot of kids with lots of social options, if that makes sense. The next weekend, I was speaking at another event, happened to be another Methodist event, that was 3 districts in the less populated part of Virginia. Exact same format. I think I might have even done the same talks. The first one was 3,000 kids, the second one was 300 kids, but otherwise it was the same thing. And as I stood up there in the front of the room, I'm going to lower my shade here because that sun on my face is visually distracting. I stood in the front of the room. My flight had been late, and I was feeling kind of distracted and rushed and anxious even. And I stood in that space. The worship was already playing right as I pulled into the parking lot and ran in there. So I was flustered. Worship's going. I'm trying to get into this head and heart space of being present to what God might do here with these kids. And I'm looking at the kids' faces as I'm praying. And during this worship time, they're all standing up. And I just got like slayed with several realizations very quickly, right in a row. First one was not a very generous thing that I noticed, which was there's a lot of kids here who feel other, kind of like first thing I noticed actually was there was multiple kids with some obvious handicap, either in a wheelchair or with those permanent I forgot the word. What do you call those when I'm like, you know what I mean? Yeah. So I noticed that wasn't necessarily ungenerous. It was just an odd thing and then I noticed quite a few of the kids that in one way or another would not have necessarily been the pretty and popular kids. Whether it was that they were too wide or too thin or had lots of acne or they had a haircut that revealed that they didn't have a lot of social options. I noticed there's a lot of misfits here of some sort, a way higher percentage. But right on the heels of that, I noticed they are all fully engaged in worship and they are not wallflowering. And then right on the heels of that, I was overwhelmed with how beautiful that was. That here these kids were just full-throated, singing, present, not feeling out of place or shy or that they needed to hide. And I got overwhelmed with emotion. And I started to choke up. I wasn't literally crying, but I was right on the edge, right? Constricted throat, tears in my eyes. And it was right then when they announced me as the speaker and asked me to come to the stage. And I'm walking up to the stage and I'm totally in like panic, thinking, I don't know what to do. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get words out. And I'm not sure if I should acknowledge, I wasn't thinking clearly, right? I'm not sure if I should acknowledge what just happened here. Like, should I say, you guys, it's so beautiful. You're just so much of losers and it's awesome. I knew that wasn't right, but I wasn't sure to whether to acknowledge it or not. Luckily, I didn't, and I got through that moment. But then I felt like I've got to find out what's going on here. What is it that's unique here? And I started asking questions of some of the leaders, and eventually, one of the organizers sent me over to talk with the event registrar. I had never met her before. She was a 60-something youth worker, volunteer youth worker named Kathy, and she ended up going through our coaching program years later. She's just an amazing person. And started chatting. I was asking questions. I was trying to ask questions without being offensive, right? Eventually, we're looking at the list of the groups who were there, and that's when I saw it. They were all little groups. There was one youth group there of 20 kids, which I would say is a kind of an average sized youth group. All the rest of them were between like 2 and 7 kids. I also did some youth worker training that weekend, and there were 2 paid youth workers at the whole event. All of the rest were volunteer point people, or not even point people, volunteers, who would say to me all weekend long, oh, we don't have a very good youth ministry. It's just like me and that other dad, and we host the kids for dinner and talk about Jesus every week. And man, I'd spent a lot of years trying to develop a flashy youth ministry that had lots of bells and whistles and lots of complexity. And the aha in that moment is these people, because of their smallness and their lack of wrong-headed presumption about what great youth ministry looks like, they are on a pathway to way better youth ministry than all of the stuff that I do. Here's what I've concluded. Being well-resourced is a seduction to the belief that it is those resources that bring transformation in kids' lives. And it's just not true, but it's so easy to subconsciously believe that that's the reality. If we have great upfront speaking, the best games, if we do wonderful events, that's what's going to make their faith sticky. And it's not that. It's really not, right? So, sidebar, there's been a lot of really, really good research done about adolescent faith development over the last 20 years. And there are many good studies, but I want to highlight 2 of them that neither of them are all that new, but in my opinion, the best ones were the National Study of Youth and Religion. And if you want to look at nsyr.org, you can see lots of information. That's the one some of you have heard of, Christian Smith. That was the study that he led. And there have been multiple books written out of that by him, as well as probably the best one come out of that study was what I consider the most important youth ministry book ever written. That was Kenda Dean's book, Almost Christian. It's the findings of the National Study of Youth and Religion for the Christian Church. The other one that I think really was a light bulb for so many of us who've been around for a while was the Sticky Faith research done by Cara Powell and Fuller Youth Institute. In a way that those researchers would probably be very uncomfortable, I am going to summarize what they found and where they overlap. 3 findings. Number 1, how about if I copy and paste this for you too? Because then you can just grab it if you want to. Three findings. Parents make a bigger difference than we do by far. Teenagers need to be part of the congregation and not isolated. And teenagers need to verbalize their faith more than being told what to believe. So what size church do those more naturally tend to exist? In a smaller church. This is why I think the pathway to great youth ministry is shorter in a smaller church. So I don't know the size of your church, but I know that Youth Ministry Consultants has a lot of strength in working with and supporting smaller churches. So I'm assuming at least some of you are in mid to small size churches. And I just want to say, stop thinking of your ministry as inferior because of its size. Start to hold on to a truth that is a big part or can be part of its strength. Here's the math.
Marco, let me jump in and say, I've always loved you. You're a great guy. But this last point is like right in our sweet spot. So
It is.
yeah, I appreciate the depth of the way in which you said it, rather than just skimming over and saying, oh, by the way, if you're in a small church, you're doing great ministry. I appreciate the way in which you've wrapped around it. So you just hit a home run in my mind, buddy. You've been on my pedestal for a long time, but now you just
Thanks,
way
man.
up.
Thanks. So I have come up, this is tiny bit tongue in cheek, but it's still true. I have come up with a mathematic equation for good youth ministry. Oh, let's even call it great youth ministry, right? Now, anybody who knows me, Tiger and Jenny would be those particularly would laugh because they know that I am not an equations guy. But here's the math of great youth ministry. A grace-filled, caring adult who's willing to be present to teenagers, plus a small-ish group of teenagers, plus, it's a complex equation, the power of the Holy Spirit and the presence of Jesus Christ equals great youth ministry. Man, we just so often over-complexify it and try to make it something other than that. Yeah. Okay. I should try to wrap up in 10 minutes so we can have a little Q&A. So let me give you value number 3. Contextualization is value number 3. In an age of splintered youth culture, great youth ministries have discerned an approach to ministry that is wonderfully unique to their context. Listen, little background or framing for this. Youth culture used to be one monolithic thing. And around the turn of the millennium, for a reason I won't have time to explain here. The short version is adults, baby boomers, started worshiping at the altar of youth. And in doing so, we elevated youth culture from being a subculture to being the dominant culture in America, synonymous with pop culture. But youth culture doesn't want to be the dominant culture in America, so it splintered. And today, there is not a unified or monolithic youth culture. There are thousands of youth cultures. Every one of you are leading a multicultural youth ministry, whether you have racial or economic diversity or not. And most of your students live in multiple cultures. Now, that has created a reality here's my strong statement. Everywhere I go in the world, and this is not just an American thing, everywhere I go in the world these days, the best youth ministries are weird. Always, not sometimes, always. They have a high degree of awareness, self-awareness of their uniquenesses, and they embrace those rather than tamping them down. Really important. And I tell youth workers all the time, figure out the uniqueness of yourself and your ministry and fly your freak flag.
Can you tell our pastors though? Can you tell?
Sure. You can just quote me on it. Okay. Here's some deeply biblical logic. You're weird. I mean, if you don't like that word, you can say, I'm unique. That's fine. You're weird. So am I, right? Your church is weird. It's unique. It has a history of pain and joy and beautiful and ugly things. It has a certain collection of people that are already there. You have already a certain group of teenagers that God has placed in your midst, plus a desire to reach some others. You have your own story and that of your volunteer leaders that work with you. It is unique. It is weird, and your church is weird. So why should some other church's youth ministry program work in your context? They're weird too. Now, of course, we can share ideas and learn best practices from each other, but a big part of our role, if we want to have successful youth ministries that are thriving, is to figure out, almost like an anthropologist, figure out what is the unique context of my church and our youth ministry, and what are we called to do. I'm going to give you 5 contextualization prompts that I want to suggest would be a great dinner conversation for you and some leaders in your church. Maybe pull together some people in a home and host a dinner where you use these 5 prompts as a way to think about your uniqueness. Something unique about your part of the country, something unique about your town or neighborhood, something weird and wonderful about your denomination or church, something weird and annoying about your denomination or church, something unique and quirky about your youth ministry that you love. Okay, now I told you at the beginning that when I developed this content originally, it was 6 values great youth ministries embrace. And I didn't think we really had time to do all 6 today. So I chose 3 of them. But I'm going to give you the other 3 now also, as well as a sentence for each, which hopefully if you want, you can just copy and paste for yourselves out of the chat there. One is the role of the Holy Spirit. I just see this, again, when I'm looking at youth ministries that are thriving, I see that, well, you can see the sentence, great youth ministries are more responsive than proactive, more about discernment than planning, all with a keen ear to the unique guidance of the Holy Spirit. Great planning and brainstorming can be really fruitful, but I have discovered late in life, I am a better youth worker when I'm trying to follow the leading of the Holy Spirit, when I'm trying to exercise spiritual discernment rather than only my intuition and experience. Those are important, but they're not as good. Last night, leading my small group with my squirrely group there were 9 8th grade boys there last night. One of them, when he shows up, consistently wreaks havoc on the whole group. I, of course, am leveraging my experience and insight into middle school boys and the scripture passage we were talking about, but it's better and more fruitful when I'm able to follow in the leading of the Holy Spirit. The 5th one is the role of parents. This is hopefully not new to you guys. Great youth ministries are passionate about helping parents, who are the key influence on teenage faith, succeed in their God-given roles. And then finally, integration over isolation. We'll see long-term faith more often when we work to decrease the constant ghettoization of teenagers and help them find meaningful belonging in the life of the church. If that's a new idea to you, I'd really encourage you to look more at like Almost Christian, Kenda Dean's book. There's just been a lot of really good research about how our wrong-headed approach about creating an isolated group of teenagers is the best approach, how wrong that was. By the way, great book that's not about identifying the problem, but instead about what solutions might look like, was written by Sam Halverson, and it's called One Body. Okay, 9:46 here in San Diego. We have 14 minutes or 13 or 12 for any questions or comments. That was a lot of information very quickly. What do you want to ask about or talk about?
Did you, the last part about the questions we can ask about our context, is that going to be, is that up on the chat room, or because
Yeah, it's in the chat.
I'm going to take notes.
Yeah, it's in the chat.
Okay, good. Because that could be a fun conversation around a coffee table together. But what is
Absolutely
about our situation?
Yeah. I mean, you can reflect on that on your own.
Yes.
I just have found it's more fruitful if you do it with a few other people.
Yeah. Okay. Because that's got some good stuff about that. Everybody's context is different.
Somebody from St. Luke's just asked, can you please help me understand what you mean by the constant ghettoization of teenagers? Yeah, I'm using strong language there. I mean our propensity to isolate teenagers. So this is not just a church thing. This is an American culture thing. We have I believe that we have a belief in the United States and in some other countries in the world too, that teenagers are broken, right? And need to be fixed. In fact, the question I often ask, I think I asked it in the other time that I did a webinar with you guys, is do you see teenagers as a problem to be solved or as a wonder to behold? And the vast majority of people in America, 90-some percent, 98% see teenagers as a problem to be solved or as broken. And then that becomes their lens through which they approach them. So even if they actually do have some level where they want teenagers to thrive, their assumption is that what we need to do is to isolate them and treat them like children. Take away decisions, reduce their ability to have risks because they're not good at making decisions anyhow, and isolate them and infantilize them. That isolation of teenagers, which has become pervasive in America, the average teenager in America spends approximately 0 minutes a day with adults in the world of adults. And the only adults they spend time with are adults who come into their world. The church has followed culture on that, and we have, over the last 70 years, developed approaches to youth ministry where and I've done these too, where we think that the best way to see teenagers grow is to create this isolated youth group that meets in a little building on the other side of the parking lot where they can have their own space. And the research has just shown that that is untrue. That teenagers, here's some data, teenagers who have a connection, like an identity anchoring for their faith into a youth group, but never the church, the congregation, are less likely to be connected to faith 10 years down the road than those who have an identity anchoring for their faith in the congregation and never attend the youth group. Now, I am not arguing for the dismantling of youth group. I think my 8th grade boys that I meet with benefit from that time of a homogeneous group, but it's got to be a both and, right? This is why so many people in like this, I think originally came from Chap Clark, have talked about how we need to reverse the ratio of 1 adult for every 5 teenagers to 5 adults for every 1 teenager. Not that you need 5 volunteers in your youth ministry for every teenager in it, that would be creepy. It's that instead that we want to have a vision for teenagers being connected in multiple relationships with multiple adults in the church and having a sense of connection and integration with the congregation. That's what I mean. That was a long answer to your question.
That's kind of one of the reasons why I've never liked the phrase big church, because it's that isolated place
Yeah.
that you don't go to until you're a big person. And
Yeah.
that's always bugged me.
I was sitting with a group of youth workers a couple of weeks ago, and they were all from the Atlanta area, and they were all Methodist youth workers because that conference had hosted this gathering. One of them was from a big church with tons of money, wealthy church, beautiful facilities. They are big enough that they had 4 full-time youth ministry staff, actually maybe 5, because I think they had an admin too. And I've been there before. They have a youth center that anybody would salivate for. Beautiful, big, gorgeous. But it was a block and a half away from the main church building. So giant parking lot and across the street. I noticed in our first day of meeting with this group that all of the other youth workers, who coincidentally were all older than this one youth worker, they were all orienting around her. She had the power because she was in this big and impressive isolated youth ministry. Not that she wanted it, I just saw this dynamic playing out. And so at some point I said, there's so much great about that ministry, let's be honest. But their biggest inhibitor to lifelong vibrant faith in teenagers is the block and a half of blacktop that separates their youth building from the rest of the congregation. That's the reality. I would have aspired to have a place like that. I wouldn't anymore. Yeah. Any other questions?
Marco, I'd love to revisit Sammy's question about can you explain this to our lead pastors? That's what I'm seeing is we've got a bunch of Gen Xers who grew up in the 90s and 2000s under that model of youth ministry.
Yes.
That's
right.
what they're saying is success. And how do you translate for those people?
Yeah. Well, fair question. And it's one that comes up all the time in the coaching groups that I lead and stuff. That there's the youth worker wants to bring change, may already see these things, but is working for wonderful leaders maybe who want to go back to the glory days. This has only gotten worse because of the pandemic, right? Because the assumption is everything was great in 2019, even if it wasn't, right? I would suggest a couple things. One is and it depends on who your pastor is or what their person, what your relationship with them is like. You could read a book together if they're open to that. You could just say that you want to have a discussion around some of the things you heard at this webinar and talk about it. I mean, there's a lot of good resources out there today that I'm not the only one saying this stuff, right? Youth culture has changed. The experience of being a teenager in America is not the same as it was 20 years ago. It just isn't. And it wasn't the same before the pandemic. And it's even more not the same today, right? So our response, if we want to be true to our calling, has to shift also. And so to help your senior leader know that we have the same mission. We want to reach teenagers and see them get discipled and have vibrant faith that outlasts the youth group. We're eye to eye on this. But what I'm seeing is that our old ways of doing this were appropriate to their time. Sidebar, sometimes not theologically appropriate, but they worked culturally. They just don't work. And this is being universally observed across North American youth ministry. It's not only me with this opinion. Everybody's saying this. So, yeah, there's also another resource I'd point you to. Maybe some of you have heard of 10 by 10. It's 10 by 10 is a giant collaborative effort of about 150 organizations. Tiger and Rebecca and Ginny and I have all been part of meetings to that for that together. It's an effort to make faith matter more for 10 million teenagers in 10 years' time. And we are now 1 year into that 10 years' time. Their website has a ton of resources, and many of the resources, there's a whole section of the website that is resources for senior leaders. So you might go there and see if there's, I mean, you could suggest your senior leader go there, but unless they're really motivated to consider this, they might not do it on their own. But you might find an article or something there that's written for the senior leader as opposed to the youth worker.
I would add that anybody trying to implement change in anyone else's life, which is what we're trying to do, it's get senior leaders to change their perspective. Your first value is one that we need to take on, which is it's a long view. It's helping. One meeting is not going to change a senior pastor to go, oh, I never thought of that. That's amazing. You go do youth ministry weirdly now. But we have to see it as consistently repeating core values that line up with the church's values, but are going to be implemented in this unique context differently than what they experienced. I always say you were never their age in this age, because they have to kind of have this dawning awareness that we can't replicate what I experienced when I was in youth group, and that's going to be awesome. So yeah, I like your first value. It's a long view if we're going to change anyone else's perspective about anything.
Yeah,
it can be frustrating.
Tiger, I noticed on you guys' website that there's a course there that you lead on leading change. Is that something that would help people on this?
Probably would. I think we try to address that issue. What are some mistakes we make and how to think through helping change in ourselves, other people, thinking, behavior. Yeah, that webinar might be helpful.
So that's on our resources tab on our website. So I'll put a link to the chat in there, but yeah, feel free to tune into that. Are there any final questions before we wrap up this morning? Ryan says, considering our ever-changing culture in which teenagers live and interact every day, what's your advice for leaders to help navigate culture biblically instead of follow it blindly?
Oh, wow. That's a whole nother webinar.
Do that in 1 minute.
Yeah, that's a minute and a half answer.
I'm going to make a couple very quick responses to that, acknowledging it deserves a lot more time than this, right? With the changes that have been occurring in how teenagers learn, we must prioritize offering places of practice over telling them what to believe. Again, I could do another 45-minute webinar on this. Maybe we'll do this, but places of practice are, in short, doing stuff and saying stuff. So give them opportunities, prioritize hosting opportunities for them to be able to live out, try things on, whether it's surveying or worshiping or doing prayer practices, where doing stuff and saying stuff, prioritizing the verbalization of faith. If you never read Amanda Drury's book, Saying is Believing, it's a must read, one of my top 5 youth ministry books. So those, and saying stuff, by the way, is verbalization of belief and faith and doubts and questions, which means we have to create a safe place for that. If we prioritize places of practice over telling them what to believe, we will be more fruitful. So that would be my primary response to that. That is, I think that it's great to talk about culture and help kids develop wisdom and how to discern what messages that they're receiving from their culture. But just telling them, we've found, has very little impact. It might look, we might get the false positive of thinking that there's the right kind of impact taking place, but it doesn't stick. The book is are you asking me to tell you what the book was again? It's called Saying is Believing. by Amanda Drury. Drury. She's a professor at Indiana Wesleyan. Okay, 1 minute after the hour.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Marco. This is a really encouraging hour, and I hope you heard so clearly that your work in small churches matters, that when there's the allure of the big shiny ministries, that God has you in these weird contexts for really great purposes. And I hope you're leaving encouraged and equipped to lean even more into this. There's a link in the chat for a quick feedback survey. We don't want to answer questions you're not asking. So we would love to know, what do you want to talk about at these monthly times together? And the Leading Change webinar is also linked in the chat. If you used a code to attend today, use that same code. If you want a code for free, just shoot me a message and I'll get you one. But we're just thrilled that you were here today, and we'd love to serve you if you want coaching or further resourcing. We're here for you. So thank you, Marco. Thanks, everyone, and enjoy the rest of your day.